As is basically standard for fandom artists, I've made plenty of OCs and or self-inserts for every major fandom I've been in. The earliest examples I can think of are the ones I made for Happy Tree Friends, which really isn't something I should have been into as a 13-year-old, but what can you do? Aside from that, I've also made sonas and OCs for Danganronpa, Undertale, Lalan's Curse, and of course, Genshin Impact. I redesigned my Genshin Sona just a few months ago and considered making a video where I yap about her story and design and all that, but this isn't about her. Instead, I'll be focusing more on a pair of Genshin OCs I made around the summer of 2021, Eloma and Meixing. I'll go over the kinda undercooked lore and gameplay I gave them, my decision to turn them into Honkai Star Rail OCs instead, and all the changes I made along the way. Let's get started. Since I created her first, we'll begin with Eloma. By the way, in the many years that I've had her, I thought her name was pronounced Eloma, and it was literally right before I started recording this script that I realized it's not that. So if I trip up the pronunciation, it's out of habit. Anyways, she was originally an electro-polearm wielder from Fontaine. I created her shortly before Inazuma released, so naturally Fontaine wasn't out either. What we knew at the time was that it's the nation of justice, it's based on France, and it has a thing for spectacles. So one day I thought, what if public aggrandized executions were a common phenomenon? What if I make an OC who was a prominent executioner? And so the cogs started turning from there. I knew I was taking a risk making an OC whose lore was built entirely on guesswork, but who could stop me? Fun fact, by the way, Eloma's name means life in Finnish because I love irony. Basically, Eloma's whole thing was that she was one of, if not the most prominent executioner in the nation, with over 100 deaths to her name. Having been born and raised in Fontaine, her morals and sense of justice are unshakable, even if they're debatably skewed. She strongly believes that some people are simply too evil to be reformed and would be better off dying for their crimes. So while she doesn't exactly enjoy her job, since it's still pretty bleak, she does at least take satisfaction in knowing there's one less monster in the world. And just to be clear, her moral standards aren't like astronomically high. She does have sympathy for people who, for example, steal food to feed their families or kill in self-defense, even if she thinks there should still be some consequences for that. But there's nothing but the deepest disdain in her heart for those who hurt others in the worst, most inexcusable ways possible. You know what I mean. Her motto is basically, if you've been sentenced to death, you definitely deserved it. This is all super ironic in hindsight because for her to have such a strong conviction, she needs to have a lot of trust in the Fontaine justice system and its ability to only punish the people who quote-unquote deserve it. And given how it actually is, yeah. Quick fun fact, the scar on her face is from the time a criminal who was sentenced to death had a breakdown right before she was taken to the guillotine. She lashed out at the guards, screaming and crying desperately to escape the punishment, and Eloma had to come over and help subdue her. In the struggle, the criminal grabbed a dagger off of one of the guards and swung it around, cutting Eloma right in the face. It was honestly a miracle the blade didn't hit either of her eyes. So that scar, combined with Eloma's sharp stare, made her really intimidating, even without considering her line of work. Anyways, again, Eloma had a lot of trust in the justice system because of how unreliable it was. Except for when it wasn't. Though most of the Fontainians supported the executions and saw them as thrilling displays of karma, there was also a vocal group who advocated against them. Those people saw the executions as needlessly cruel and accused the Fontaine courts of wrongful convictions. They were usually ignored, with the courts insisting that they're always thorough with their trials. But one day, an innocent local was sentenced to death for a crime they were framed for, and the courts didn't realize this mistake until after Eloma had already carried out the execution. Naturally, there was uproar about this as soon as this became public knowledge, and a lot of the anger was directed at Eloma because even if she didn't know, she was still the one who killed them. Eloma herself was very distraught. She'd spent most of her life condemning those who murdered innocents, only to end up doing so herself because of an error made by a system she had so much faith in. Was this even the first time? Were they lying about it being an accident? How many wrongful executions had she carried out without realizing? She wasn't sure, but she also wasn't one to exempt herself from her moral code, so she was willing to accept the due punishment. But her family wasn't having it, especially her mother Giulietta, who I totally didn't name specifically for this video because I forgot to do so beforehand. Giulietta was worried that if the angry mobs got to Eloma, they'd do far worse than just throw her in jail. And despite Eloma's insistence, she refused to believe her daughter was at fault anyways. So she made arrangements to help Eloma flee to Liyue so she could safely start anew. And that's where she still is at the start of the game. I never really decided what new job she'd have after moving. I just kind of imagined her doing random freelancing with anyone who wasn't too scared to talk to her. While writing the scripts though, I considered her becoming a vigilante since apparently she can't trust anyone's judgment but her own, but I'll get back to that idea later. Another thing I had a hard time deciding on at the time is how Eloma felt about the false execution after a long period of time had passed. If she still deeply regrets it and believes her retribution is long overdue, or if she's at the point where she's like, yeah, that whole thing sucks, but I can't really do anything to change it, so I'ma just keep it moving, I guess. And yeah, that's basically all I had come up with for Eloma's story. As you can probably guess, her entire lore falls apart solely because of the fact that Fontaine does not, in fact, do executions. Not in the way we thought, anyways. And that was a bummer for me, because as much as I'd love to say screw the canon, I'll do what I want, I'm a bit of a perfectionist and prefer when my OCs don't stray too far from canon compliance. And yes, making an AU is always an option, but somehow that didn't cross my mind back then. Anyways, I started brainstorming ideas for what to do with Eloma instead. Meixing too, since I didn't want to separate them. I considered changing Eloma's lore a bit to make it so that she was a private assassin instead. Either that or make the two of them D&D characters despite my limited knowledge. It was way later on, of course after it had actually been released, that I realized I could make them Honkai Star Rail characters instead. Cause the fun thing about making OCs for HSR is how much more freedom you have. In Genshin, if you want to be canon compliant, you only have 7 nations to work with, plus some extra areas like Enkanomiya and the Abyss, all with well-established lore. But in HSR, you have the whole galaxy as your playground. You could make up some random planet and whatever lore you want and no one can challenge you on it. You could even go to the locations page on the HSR wiki and choose any of the planets that don't have enough info for dedicated pages. Who's gonna know? So let's go over the rewritten backstory. Instead of Fontaine, Eloma's from Arivanta. She had always been the protective type due to being the eldest of 6 and also maybe because of a traumatic incident from her childhood. So joining Arivanta's justice organization only felt natural. There were multiple different branches of it, and the side she joined was the executioners. They were rarely, if ever, involved with investigations or trials directly, usually just getting the final case info/verdict and permission to carry out the given execution, and also doubling as bodyguards when need be. Everything else I said about the job earlier still applies. The Astral Express was already at Arivanta around the time the false execution occurred and the protests broke out, so Julieta begged them to let Eloma board the express so they could take her far away from anyone who could hurt her. They agreed, and that's how Eloma got a new life and a new family. And later on, she joined the Galaxy Rangers, the perfect faction for her new self-reliant vigilante lifestyle, and now she just kind of comes and goes. There, nothing else needs to change. Unless I come up with more ideas later, I definitely will. Everything I say here is still subject to change. Anyways, now it's really funny to imagine Eloma coming back to the Express after the Belobog mission and finding out everything that happened. She would not be happy with the decision to lie about Cocolia being a hero. Okay, that's enough yapping about her lore. Now I want to talk about her design because that's what I'm drawing. I decided to give her a major redesign because as cute as the original one is, it feels so juvenile. Like, you can really tell Fischl was the main inspiration from the fact that Eloma looks more like a gothic princess than a hardened executioner. Not that that would have been out of place for a Hoyoverse lady. In fact, let's say her old design without the scar is her younger self now. She had her edgy teen phase and then grew older and was like, okay, I need to be elegant and mature and dignified while still being edgy. Also, that hairstyle just had to go. I already used it on 2 other OCs and I can't keep getting away with it. It's cute, but I need to let it go. By the way, this video isn't sponsored, I wish, but I used Milano for most of the brainstorming process and can confirm that all the shilling was true and it's been a ton of help. So after meandering through Pinterest and its sea of AI slop, I put together a pretty solid reference board for Eloma's new design. I decided to make the outfit a 3-piece suit because 1, it suited the sleek formal look I wanted to give her, and 2, this game is severely lacking women in suits. The outfit is actually a stylized version of the uniform that Arivantic executioners wear. It's designed to resemble funeral attire and make them look just as stylish as they are intimidating. Again, the thing about treating executions like a big spectacle still applies. Also, you might notice a bunch of flowers sewn around Eloma's blazer. That's another staple of the uniform. See, I love flower symbolism and really wanted to cover her outfit in a flower related to death, but it's hard to find one that was the exact color and appearance I had in mind. So with the same freedom I mentioned earlier, I just made something up. These flowers are known as chenikasa, or carcass blossoms, named as such because of their tendency to grow on and around dead bodies. So if a living person wears one of these flowers, it means they're either an executioner, wearing it the same way a warrior wears the bones of past enemies as a warning to future ones, or a person living in exile, to indicate that they're quote-unquote socially dead. And if someone gives you this flower, that's one hell of a threat. Anyways, I also decided to go with this gorgeous bubble braid hairstyle that I've somehow never given an OC before. No specific reason for that part, I just like it a lot. The concept, sketching, and line art phases were all relatively chill, but what really put me through the 27 stages of grief was the colors. The colors! This is a big reason why the drawing took me 15 hours, though I'm not sure if CSP's timer is all that accurate, because it said the sketch alone took me 2 hours, but I'm pretty sure that was just because I was on video call with my friends and paying more attention to their Ace Attorney playthrough than this drawing. Anyways, my first big hurdle was the outfit. See, Eloma has long black hair and a black suit that overlaps with that. And if there's one thing that was drilled into my head in my 4 years of being an illustration major, it's to always make sure adjacent colors aren't too close in value so they aren't hard to distinguish. So you can imagine the amount of trouble I went through to make sure her suit is dark enough to read as black and not gray, but not so dark that it blends in with her hair. At a point, I decided to experiment with giving her a white suit instead, and she looks really good in white. But after a lot, and I mean a lot of back and forth, I decided to stick with the black and make it work, because one, I was so used to the idea of a black suit that it was hard for me to adjust, and two, I still wanted Eloma's dark colors to contrast with Meixing's light colors. Maybe I'll save the white suit for whoever wants her hand in marriage. As you'll see in the final drawing, I did figure out a workaround by giving her gold shoulder embellishments to split up her hair and the rest of the suit. Speaking of the gold embellishment, something from the concept design that didn't make it to the final was this gold cluster of chains that was supposed to resemble a ribcage. I loved the idea in theory, but in practice it felt like it was just gonna make that area look cluttered. Yes, insane thing to say about a design for a game that's the final boss of cluttered designs, but it was bugging me, alright? My next hurdle was coloring the smaller details. You know how I said I'm a bit of a perfectionist when it comes to my OC's lore? Same things go for the designs, to my detriment. I don't have the patience to make my designs as detailed as the Hoyoverse ones, but I always want to get close, so I made sure to give Eloma lots of small details that I'm unlikely to ever draw again. I struggled with their colors because, again, I didn't want them to be hard to distinguish, but I also didn't want them to be distractingly bright. It was a lot of trial and error, but I figured it out in the end. Also, one teeny tiny detail I kept as another callback to her old design is this circle and X combo, which is supposed to be a simplified skull and crossbones symbol. Another thing I was worried about was the scythe, because weapon design is not my thing. In fact, if memory serves, which it usually doesn't, Eloma's original scythe was the first and last time I actually tried it out, and you can tell. But with the help of a bunch of references that I kind of Frankenstein together with some personal twists, I actually had a somewhat easier time with it than I did with Eloma herself. Fun fact, by the way, Eloma's scythe is called Ichor Drain, as in the golden blood of the Greek gods. That's why it had those gold drip-like designs. I never came up with a name for the updated design, so I'll just stick with that for now. Don't let her anywhere near Amphorius. Lastly, let's talk about her gameplay. Like I said at the start, I originally made Eloma to be an electro polearm wielder with that scythe as her signature weapon. Of course, now that she's an HSR, her type is lightning, but deciding on her gameplay path was a little tricky. First, I considered Hunt since it just felt right, but then I was like, Destruction also works really well because then she can have a thing of draining her teammates' HP as a callback to her Grim Reaper inspiration. Yes, I'm stepping on Castaris's toes a bit, but she already stomped all over Seela, so we'll call this even. Here's the difference though. While Castaris drains HP from all her allies, Eloma just kind of picks one, says fuck you specifically, and takes off a huge chunk of their HP to buff herself. But see, this is actually of mutual benefit because then the ally also gets buffs from this. Which ones? I don't know. Making kits isn't my strong point either, so I only really have vague ideas right now. But at least this means she'll work well in dual DPS teams with characters like Blade and Mighty who benefit from losing HP anyways. So yeah, Destruction is her gameplay path, and Hunt and Trailblaze are her lore paths. Anyways, that is more than enough about Eloma. Let's move on to her companion. I'll be so real, Meixing was never as well developed as Eloma was. At the time, I was just like, okay, so I have this brooding ex-executioner who wears mostly black. What she needs now is a bubbly pink companion who's debatably more unhinged than she is, somehow. So originally, Meixing was a 4-star electro catalyst from Liyue, and her main thing was that she was a super talented jack of all trades who did multiple odd jobs around town. There were two problems though. One, she got bored very easily and randomly abandoned jobs and projects if she didn't like it anymore. If there was a contract involved, she'd either completely disrespect it or not sign it at all so she wouldn't be held down in the first place. Zhongli would not be proud. At a point, people only really worked with her out of begrudging necessity because sometimes her talent outweighed how unreliable she is. And two, she was not above working with some very shady people. Like, she had dealings with treasure hoarders and low-level Fatui members because I don't know. She was just doing it for the love of the game. Her motivations are based on vibes, she's loyal to no one except herself, and her goal is to have fun. For her aesthetic, she was way ahead of Kenichi's time with the whole digital thing, but back then, her actual style was so difficult to nail down. Like, I had a general idea of how I wanted her to dress, but I wasn't sure what the style was called so I could look up references. After lots of research, I figured out it's Harajuku/Dekorake, so that's what I based her original design on. But that still didn't cover the retro digital side of her aesthetic. It was way later on when I first revisited her and tried again that I realized that what I had in mind was pastel vaporwave. Duh! Anyways, this aesthetic of hers is honestly another big reason why I wanted to move her and Eloma to Honkai Star Rail. It would fit way better there than it would in Genshin. I mean, yeah, technically it could still work because again, Kenichi exists, but you know. Back then, though, I did think it'd be funny if Meixing somehow had access to modern technology, like actually modern, not fantasy equivalents like the Akasha basically being the internet, and then constantly complained that everything else was old-fashioned. Like, ugh, why do you guys still do research with dusty old books when you can just use a computer? What was I cooking? Anyways, onto her changes now that she's in HSR. She's still a 4-star because God knows this game needs them, and she's now a lightning preservation character from Punk Lord, the same world that Silverwolf is from. I originally considered making her Nihility because of a gut instinct, but then I pondered a bit longer. I thought about the many holes in the preservation market. First of all, there isn't a lightning preservation character yet, which is part of the reason why I changed my mind on making her Quantum. Secondly, you know how when you fight that one soda ape enemy, you're supposed to bring a shielder so the bottle it throws bounces back at it? What if that gimmick was the basis for Meixing's gameplay? What if the shields she applies are basically quote-unquote firewalls that reflect a portion of the enemy's damage back towards it, kind of like an Uno reverse? And it could be applied in a similar way as Huohuo's skill, where you choose a primary target to get a bigger shield, plus I can't stop doing these things in one take, damn! And it could be applied in a similar way as Huohuo's skill, where you choose a primary target to get a bigger shield, plus an increased taunt value, and then the adjacent allies get smaller shields. And, maybe like an inverse cipher, Meixing's burst does more damage depending on how many times a shielded ally was hit before she uses it. I know I'm making a lot of comparisons, but it helps me get my point across. And of course, the aesthetics of her gameplay would revolve heavily around her Vaporwave theme, with the desktop screens and clouds and .exe stuff. I don't know, if you guys have other ideas, I'm all ears. For her lore path, you know an epiphany I had while writing the script and describing how she kind of just does whatever is fun for her? She would make one hell of a maxed fool. Yes, I'm stepping on more toes, but she was here first, I can get away with it. Anyways, if she's gonna be a maxed fool, she's gonna need a foolish mask. I did some brainstorming and research on different types of Chinese masks and settled on one of those beautiful white Hanfu masks with a little inspiration taken from Vendetta hacker masks. I like to think her mask's power helps a lot with planet hopping, so Meixing can go to random worlds, do whatever it takes to satiate her boredom, and then skedaddle as soon as either she gets tired of the place or the wanted poster starts showing up. And to call back her affiliation with the shadiest people around, she also occasionally helps the Stellaron Hunters, mainly because she and Silverwolf go way back and often owe each other favors. I just know gaming sessions between them would go absolutely nuts. Like, Silverwolf is locked in, she's giving it her all. Meanwhile, Meixing's just messing around and rage baiting all the other players. For her design, I mainly wanted to give her an updated outfit and a more cohesive palette. The original was from back when I still did marker art, so there was only so many pastel colors I had on hand. Now that I'm doing it digitally, I could go crazy with the pastels, which was a bit of a problem. Again, the values, it's always the values. A lot of the pastel colors I tried to use were really close, if not straight up identical, so I had to do a bit of tweaking to make sure they were distinct without looking too dark. I had a similar issue with the parts where her hair overlapped with the pink parts of her outfit, but gradients came in clutch there, so it's fine. Aside from that, I had a much easier time with her than I did with Eloma because pink girls always got my back. Also, this is hard to see in the time lapse since it doesn't zoom in, but one of my favorite design choices was making her eyes resemble those classic vaporwave sunsets. I originally thought of giving her tinted glasses, but I didn't want them to obscure the eye design. I'm also a big fan of giving her body glitter, which just looks so good on dark skin because, you know, you can actually see the glitter, you can actually tell that it's there. I don't know what part of the time lapse this voiceover will be on by now, but you'll notice I removed the white fishnet somewhere near the end. I liked the idea, but in practice it was kind of bugging me having that many light-colored segments in a row, so I decided to break it up and put stickers on her legs instead. Anyways, I've said enough about the both of them individually, so let's move on to how they are together. In their original versions, I didn't have that much in mind for Eloma and Meixing's relationship. I just wanted my own pink and black/purple pair of friends because everyone knows those are peak. For the most part, they were just a pair of locals who occasionally hung out mainly because of Meixing persistently seeking out Eloma's company despite her cold demeanor and eventually getting her to warm up. But now, we have a solemn vigilante who's dead set on punishing anyone who steps out of line, and we also have a volatile troublemaker who's long overdue for some consequences but near impossible to catch. I think you can pick up what I'm putting down. Meixing has been a thorn in Eloma's side since their very first encounter. Like, yeah, she hasn't done anything bad enough to warrant an execution, but Lang knows Eloma is tempted to do one anyways because of how sick and tired she is of Meixing's antics. They're at a point where Meixing actively waits around for Eloma to catch up to her so she can mess with her a bit and then disappear at the last second just to piss her off a little more. And I'm being serious, Meixing is the only person who can make Eloma outwardly angry. Usually with her, it's the cold, quiet type of rage. Like, she doesn't show it, but you know just from the air around her that you're phenomenally cooked. But almost every fight with Meixing leads to her completely losing her composure. Like, she's shouting and slipping up and just really letting out her anger. No one gets under Eloma's skin like that, and Meixing knows it and she loves it. There are very few things she enjoys more than unraveling people who think they're so above it all. In fact, if she were to debut near the end of an important quest or something, I can see her telling her companion, maybe Sparkle or any other max fool, to go on without her because she's gonna stay behind and wait for her favorite playmate. So to Eloma, this is a blood-boiling rivalry, but to Meixing, this is the most fun she's ever had. I love to imagine one of the rare moments Eloma lets herself loosen up just enough to vent about Meixing to the other nameless, and Marge is just like, I don't know, it's starting to sound like you're obsessed with her for other reasons. Poor girl wasn't allowed to speak for the rest of the conversation. By the way, something funny I realized before I made the HSR switch is how similar Eloma and Meixing ended up being to Raiden Shogun and Yae Miko respectively, even though, again, I made both of them before Inazuma's release. Between Eloma and Raiden, we got electricity powers, purple color motif, polearm as a weapon, questionable yet stubbornly held ideals, a history of harming those who don't fit that ideal, and a pretty chill personality underneath all that intimidation factor. And with Meixing and Yae Miko, we got electricity powers again, pink hair, a cunning trickster-ex demeanor, pointy ears, and a certain devotion to a certain purple lady. Maybe I'm a prophet, or maybe Hoyoverse copied my notes again. Who knows? Who knows? Okay, that's all I got now. Sorry, the script is long enough. Thank you guys again for watching. I might make a follow-up video expanding their story and other relationships some more, especially if this one does well, but there's no guarantee either way, so please keep that in mind. Also, I realize I've never done a social media plug in any of my videos. I'm on all these platforms under the name Vermilivon, though the only place I post consistently is Instagram. And I also have my coffee for anyone who'd like to buy commissions or just tip me. All of them are links down below. If you made it this far, comment with a pink and or purple heart emoji so I can add you to my will. And maybe subscribe for more Yap Fest because I have plenty of stuff planned. Okay, I'll see you guys next time. Thank you. Bye.